The day started like any other until I found myself in a theater, sitting beside my stepson Ethan, feeling a tension I couldn't explain. At first, it was just a glance, then a touch, but by the time the credits rolled, my heart was racing, and I knew our relationship would never be the same. What happened next left me questioning everything I thought I knew about boundaries, family, and myself. Ethan wasn't my biological child, but over the years, we had developed a cordial, respectful relationship. When I married his father, he was just a teenager, polite but distant, as many boys his age are. Now in his mid-20s, Ethan had grown into a confident young man, self-assured, athletic, and with a maturity that always seemed beyond his years. Our interactions were easy and uncomplicated. I wasn't trying to replace his mother, and he seemed to appreciate that. I thought of him as family, of course, but I kept my role as his stepmother simple. Ethan had his life, and I had mine. Occasionally, we'd spend time together when his father was busy, dinners, quick chats about his studies or hobbies, but there was never anything extraordinary about our dynamic. That's why, when Ethan invited me to a movie, it didn't seem out of the ordinary. "Dad's working late," he had said, his tone casual. "Want to catch that new action movie? I've got tickets." It was a thoughtful gesture, and I saw it as an opportunity to strengthen our bond. After all, it was important to maintain a healthy relationship, especially since his father was often preoccupied with work. I agreed without giving it a second thought, not realizing how much that simple decision would alter the course of our relationship. Ethan was easy to talk to, and his calm demeanor always made him pleasant company. As we drove to the theater that evening, I felt relaxed, looking forward to a quiet night out. But as we settled into our seats, something felt different. It wasn't anything he said or did, it was the way he looked at me, the way his presence seemed to fill the space between us. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was reading too much into nothing. But as the movie began and the theater's dim light cast shadows across his face, I felt a strange awareness I couldn't shake. I didn't want to dwell on it. I didn't want to acknowledge it. But a part of me, small and buried, couldn't ignore that something about our relationship was shifting, and I wasn't sure how to handle it. The movie theater was dark, the only light coming from the flickering images on the screen. I tried to focus on the film, but my thoughts kept drifting to Ethan. He was sitting closer than usual, his arm brushing against mine every now and then. It wasn't intentional, or at least, that's what I told myself, but the contact sent a jolt through me every time it happened. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye, hoping to catch a glimpse without being noticed. To my surprise, his eyes weren't on the screen. He was looking at me. Our gazes met for a fleeting moment before he quickly turned back to the movie, but the look in his eyes lingered in my mind. It wasn't the casual glance of someone watching a movie with family, it was something else, something that made my stomach tighten. Halfway through the movie, during a quieter scene, Ethan leaned over and whispered, "Are you enjoying it?" His breath was warm against my ear, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. "Yes," I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. "It's good." He nodded, but the proximity left me feeling unsettled. It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it, the softness of his tone, the way his words seemed to carry an unspoken meaning. As the movie continued, I became acutely aware of every movement, every glance, every moment of closeness. Ethan's hand brushed against mine, light and fleeting, as if by accident. I dismissed it, telling myself it was nothing. But then it happened again, this time, more deliberate. His fingers lingered on mine, and when I didn't pull away, he began to gently stroke my hand. My breath caught in my throat, my heart racing as I tried to make sense of what was happening. A part of me wanted to pull away, to put an end to the strange, electric tension between us. But another part, the part one didn't want to acknowledge, was drawn to the warmth of his touch. It felt forbidden, wrong, but also thrilling in a way I couldn't explain. The rest of the movie passed in a blur. I couldn't concentrate on the plot, couldn't follow the dialogue. All I could think about was the way Ethan's hand felt against mine, the way his presence seemed to fill the space around me. When the credits rolled and the lights came up, I felt like I was waking from a dream, a strange, disorienting dream that left me questioning everything. We didn't speak as we left the theater. The drive home was silent, the air between us heavy with unspoken words. I could feel Ethan glancing at me every now and then, but I kept my eyes fixed on the road, my thoughts a tangled mess. What had just happened? Was I imagining things, or had something shifted between us? That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the evening in my mind. The glances, the touch, the quiet tension, it all felt surreal, like something out of a story that couldn't possibly be my life. I tried to convince myself that I was overthinking it, that it was nothing more than an overactive imagination fueled by stress. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something had changed, and there was no going back. The next morning, Ethan was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs. He greeted me with his usual easy smile, but there was something in his eyes that made my chest tighten. "Good morning," he said, his tone casual. "Good morning," I replied, forcing a smile. I busied myself with making coffee, trying to ignore the way he watched me, the way his presence seemed to fill the room. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that things between us were different now, and I didn't know what to do about it. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and conflicted emotions. Ethan's behavior hadn't changed outwardly, he was still kind, helpful, and thoughtful, but there was an unspoken tension between us that I couldn't ignore. Every glance, every small touch, seemed charged with something I couldn't name but felt deeply. One evening, as I sat in the living room reading, Ethan walked in and sat down on the couch beside me. He was closer than usual, and I felt my pulse quicken. "What are you reading?" he asked, his voice light, but his eyes held something deeper. I held up the book, trying to keep my tone casual. "Just a mystery novel. Nothing exciting." "Sounds interesting," he said, leaning slightly toward me. His arm brushed mine, and I felt a familiar warmth spread through me. I told myself it was nothing, just a coincidence, but the way he lingered made it hard to believe that. As the evening wore on, the air between us grew heavier. I tried to focus on the words in front of me, but I couldn't concentrate. My mind kept drifting to the way Ethan's presence seemed to fill the room, the way his gaze lingered just a moment too long. When I finally looked up, I found him watching me. He didn't look away this time. "You seem distracted," he said, his voice soft but steady. "I'm just tired," I replied, my throat dry. "It's been a long day." He nodded, but his eyes didn't waver. "You've been working so hard lately. You should take some time to relax." "I'll try," I said, forcing a smile. But as I set the book down, I realized my hands were trembling. Ethan noticed too. He reached out, his hand brushing against mine. "You don't have to do everything on your own, you know. I'm here for you." The sincerity in his voice made my chest ache. I wanted to pull away, to put some distance between us, but I couldn't. His touch was warm, grounding, and I found myself leaning into it despite my better judgment. "Thank you," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. His hand lingered on mine, and I could feel the tension between us building. "You mean a lot to me," he said, his voice low. "More than I think you realize." I didn't know how to respond. My mind was screaming at me to set boundaries, to stop this before it went too far, but my heart was telling me something else entirely. The truth was, I felt it too, that inexplicable pull, that sense of connection that defied logic and reason. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the moment over and over in my mind. The way he looked at me, the way his touch lingered, the way his words seemed to carry a deeper meaning, it all felt surreal, like something out of a dream I couldn't wake from. The next evening, with his father working late again, Ethan and I found ourselves alone in the house. I was in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner when he walked in, his expression unreadable. "Need any help?" he asked. "No, I've got it," I replied, avoiding his gaze. But he didn't leave. Instead, he stepped closer, leaning against the counter as he watched me. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "I haven't," I said quickly, though we both knew it wasn't true. He tilted his head, his eyes searching mine. "If I've done something to upset you." "You haven't," I interrupted, my voice trembling. "It's just complicated." "Why does it have to be?" he asked, taking a step closer. "We're just two people who care about each other." "It's not that simple," I said, my heart pounding as I backed against the counter. "It could be," he said softly, his hand reaching out to brush a strand of hair from my face. His touch was gentle, but it sent a shiver through me. "Ethan," I began, but before I could finish, he leaned in, his lips brushing mine. The kiss was soft, tentative, as if he were giving me a chance to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself leaning into him, my hands gripping the counter for support as the kiss deepened. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathing heavily, our eyes locked. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice raw. "I shouldn't have." "It's okay," I interrupted, my own voice unsteady. I need time to think." He nodded, his eyes filled with emotion. "Take all the time you need. I just needed you to know how I feel." As he left the room, I sank onto the nearest chair, my heart racing and my thoughts a whirlwind. I knew what had just happened would change everything between us, and I didn't know if I was ready for what came next. The days after that kiss were a haze of emotions. I avoided Ethan as much as I could, telling myself it was the right thing to do. But no matter how much distance I tried to put between us, the memory of that moment lingered, his touch, the sincerity in his voice, the way he looked at me as though I was the only person in the world. I busied myself with work and household chores, hoping to distract myself from the growing tension. But Ethan wasn't making it easy. He was always there watching, waiting, his presence a constant reminder of the lines we had crossed and the ones we were dangerously close to crossing again. One evening, with the house unusually quiet, I decided to escape to the backyard, hoping the cool air would help clear my head. The sky was a deep blue, the first stars beginning to appear. I stood by the garden, letting the breeze wash over me, when I heard footsteps behind me. "Hey," Ethan's voice broke the silence. I turned, my heart pounding. He was standing a few feet away, his hands tucked into his pockets, his expression unreadable. "Hi," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. He stepped closer, his eyes searching mine. "You've been avoiding me." "I've been busy," I said quickly, though we both knew it wasn't true. "You don't have to do that," he said softly. "I know things have been complicated. But I don't want to lose what we have." "What we have?" I repeated, my voice trembling. "Ethan, we crossed a line. We can't just pretend it didn't happen." "I'm not pretending," he said, his voice firm. "And I don't regret it." His words hit me like a thunderclap. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. He stepped closer, the space between us shrinking until we were only inches apart. "I know this is complicated," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I care about you more than I should." "Ethan," I began, but he interrupted me. "Please," he said, his eyes filled with emotion. "Don't push me away." The vulnerability in his voice broke something inside me. Without thinking, I reached out, my hand resting on his arm. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice shaking. "I feel so lost." "You're not alone," he said, covering my hand with his. "We'll figure it out. Together." The moment stretched on, the air between us heavy with unspoken words. Before I could stop myself, I leaned in, my forehead resting against his. It was a small gesture, but it felt like the crossing of yet another boundary. His hand moved to my face, his touch gentle, and for a moment, the rest of the world faded away. Then, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway shattered the moment. I pulled back abruptly, my heart racing as I realized what had almost happened. "Your dad's home," I said, stepping away from him. Ethan nodded, his jaw tightening. "We'll talk later," he said quietly before walking back into the house. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, my mind replaying the events of the evening over and over. I knew I needed to put an end to this, to draw a line that couldn't be crossed again. But every time I thought about confronting Ethan, my resolve wavered. The truth was, I didn't know if I was strong enough to let him go. The next day, as I was cleaning the kitchen, Ethan walked in. He looked determined, his eyes locked onto mine. "We need to talk," he said. I set the dishcloth down, bracing myself. "Okay." He took a deep breath, his hands resting on the counter. "I know this isn't easy for you. It's not easy for me either. But I can't keep pretending I don't feel this way." "Ethan, we can't." "Why not?" he interrupted, his voice rising slightly. Why can't we just admit how we feel? No one has to know. I shook my head, tears welling in my eyes. It's not that simple. You're my stepson. This isn't just about us, it's about your father, our family. If anyone found out. They won't, he said firmly. I would never let that happen. His confidence was both reassuring and terrifying. I wanted to believe him, to trust that we could keep this secret, but I knew the risks were too great. Ethan, I can't, I said, my voice breaking. I just can't. He stepped closer, his hands gently cupping my face. I love you, he said, his voice raw with emotion. I've loved you for a long time. And I think you feel the same way. The truth in his words cut through me like a knife. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but I couldn't. The truth was, I did feel the same way, and it terrified me. I don't know what to do, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. Let me take care of you, he said, his forehead resting against mine. Just for tonight. The weight of his words was too much. I pulled away, shaking my head. I need time, I said. I need to think. He nodded, though I could see the pain in his eyes. Take all the time you need, he said softly. I'll wait. As he left the room, I sank onto a chair, my head in my hands. I didn't know how we had gotten here, but I knew one thing for certain, there was no going back. The days following my conversation with Ethan were some of the hardest I'd ever experienced. The house was filled with an unbearable silence, broken only by the sound of everyday routines that now felt anything but normal. Ethan kept his distance, sensing my need for space, but his absence only made the weight of my emotions heavier. I couldn't stop replaying our conversations, the moments we'd shared, and the lines we had crossed. David, oblivious to the turmoil brewing within our family, carried on as usual. He worked late, leaving me and Ethan to navigate the fallout of our emotions in quiet isolation. I wondered, more often than I should have, how much David suspected. Surely, he must have noticed something, the stolen glances, the subtle tension. Or maybe he was too preoccupied with his own life to see what was happening right under his roof. Ethan's attempts to act normal only heightened my guilt. At dinner, he was polite but distant, his usual warmth replaced by a careful detachment that felt forced. Every word he spoke to his father seemed calculated, every smile a mask to hide the storm raging inside him. I hated myself for being the cause of his pain, for putting him in this position, but I didn't know how to fix it. One night, with David working late again, Ethan and I found ourselves alone in the living room. I was curled up on the couch with a book, pretending to read, when he walked in. He hesitated in the doorway before sitting down on the far end of the couch. The space between us felt both immense and suffocating. "Are you okay?" he asked after a long silence. I looked up from my book, my eyes meeting his. "I don't know," I admitted. His gaze softened, and for a moment, I saw the boy I had helped raise, the boy who used to come to me for advice and reassurance. "I miss you," he said quietly. "Not like. I mean, just us. How we used to be." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. "I miss that too," I said, my voice trembling. "But things can't go back to the way they were, Ethan. Too much has happened." "Then what do we do?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Because I can't keep living like this, pretending everything is fine when it's not." "I don't know," I whispered, tears welling in my eyes. "But we have to figure it out." The tension between us was unbearable, and I could feel the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on me. I wanted to tell him that I loved him, that I cared about him more than I could ever express, but I knew that doing so would only make things worse. Instead, I said the only thing I could: "We need space." His expression shifted, a mixture of pain and resignation crossing his face. "If that's what you need," he said quietly, "I'll give it to you." The next day, Ethan packed a bag and left to stay with a friend. I stood in the doorway, watching him load his things into his car, my heart breaking with every step he took. When he turned to look at me one last time, I forced a smile, though tears streamed down my face. "I'll call you," he said. "Okay," I replied, my voice barely audible. And then he was gone. The house felt impossibly empty without him. The silence was deafening, and I found myself wandering from room to room, searching for anything that could fill the void he had left behind. I threw myself into work, into cleaning, into anything that could distract me from the aching loneliness that had settled in my chest. David noticed the change in me, but he didn't press. "You've been quiet lately," he said one evening over dinner. "Is everything okay?" "I'm fine," I replied, forcing a smile. "Just tired." He nodded, accepting my answer without question. Part of me was grateful for his obliviousness, but another part longed for him to see through the facade, to ask the questions I couldn't bring myself to answer. Ethan's absence forced me to confront my own feelings, to face the choices I had made and the consequences that had followed. I realized that I had been holding on to something that was never meant to be, something that had grown out of a place of confusion and vulnerability. Letting go was the hardest thing I'd ever had to do, but I knew it was the only way forward. Slowly, life began to regain a semblance of normalcy. I started finding joy in small things again, gardening, reading, taking long walks in the crisp morning air. I found solace in the quiet, in the space I had created for myself to heal. And though the pain of losing Ethan lingered, it became a little easier to bear with each passing day. Ethan called me a few weeks after he left. His voice was steady, but I could hear the emotion beneath it. "I just wanted to check in," he said. "See how you're doing." "I'm okay," I replied, my heart aching at the sound of his voice. "How are you?" "I'm getting there," he said. "It's hard, but I think it's what we needed." "Me too," I said softly. The conversation was brief, but it left me with a sense of hope, a belief that, in time, we could find our way back to something resembling normalcy. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but I was willing to try. Months had passed since Ethan left, and while the ache of his absence hadn't completely faded, life had started to find its rhythm again. The house was quieter, less vibrant, but I had learned to find peace in the silence. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself the space to reflect, to process, and to heal. Ethan and I kept in touch sporadically. Our conversations were brief but meaningful updates about his work, his friends, and how he was adjusting to life away from home. Each call brought a mixture of relief and sadness, a reminder of what we had been through and the bond we still shared despite the distance. I had learned a lot about myself in those months. I had learned that love, no matter how complicated, has the power to transform, but it also requires boundaries. What Ethan and I had shared was born from a place of vulnerability, of two people trying to find comfort in the chaos of their lives. It wasn't wrong to love him, but it was wrong to let that love cross lines it never should have. I realized, too, that letting go didn't mean forgetting. It meant choosing to honor the connection we had in a way that was healthy and respectful. It meant stepping back, even when it hurt, to allow both of us the space to grow. And it meant finding forgiveness for myself, for Ethan, and for the choices we had made. David and I finalized our divorce quietly, without fanfare. There was no bitterness, no dramatic goodbye, just a mutual understanding that our time together had run its course. I wished him well and truly meant it. Our marriage, though imperfect, had brought Ethan into my life, and for that, I would always be grateful. One evening, as I sat on the back porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Ethan, "Thinking of you. Hope you're doing okay." I smiled, typing back quickly, "Always thinking of you too. Proud of you, Ethan." The exchange was simple, but it carried a depth of meaning that words couldn't fully capture. It reminded me that, despite everything, the bond between us was unbreakable. It had been tested, reshaped, and redefined, but it endured. As the months turned into a year, I found myself reconnecting with the parts of me I had neglected. I joined a community gardening group, started volunteering at a local shelter, and even began exploring creative outlets like painting and writing. These small steps brought me closer to a version of myself that I hadn't seen in years, a version that felt whole, independent, and strong. Looking back, I understood that life is rarely neat or predictable. It's messy, complicated, and filled with choices that don't always have clear answers. But it's also resilient. It's about growth, about finding the strength to move forward even when the path isn't clear. The experience with Ethan taught me the importance of boundaries and the value of self-awareness. It taught me that love, in all its forms, is powerful, but it's also something that requires care, intention, and responsibility. Most importantly, it taught me that letting go doesn't mean losing, it means making space for something new, something better. As I sat there, the stars beginning to twinkle in the evening sky, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in a long time. Life was far from perfect, but it was mine, and I was learning to embrace it. Ethan and I were both on our own journeys, but I knew that, no matter where life took us, we would always carry a piece of each other with us. And in that, I found comfort. What would you do if a relationship you thought was unshakable became tangled in emotions you couldn't ignore? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective on this complex journey. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more stories that delve into the boundaries of love, trust, and resilience. The next story will leave you questioning everything.